So today we got a special video. It's going to be about the Dragons theme. It's been a year since I recorded and covered and put it on YouTube and whatever. So today I'm going to show you a little bit behind the scenes of what I did to create that. So I'll show you the synths, a little bit of theory, and I'll go over, the sounds and patches and all that stuff. So let's get started. All right, so here is the dragon theme that I made a year ago, and it's pretty much like a remake of the original in a way, but I did add a few things. So normally I go for a ratio of new sounds versus old sounds. So I usually go for like a 60-40 ratio or something like that. In this case, it was more like a 90-10 because I wanted to create a backing track for my bass guitar. And there's lots of bass guitar tracks that are pretty good. I would say they're high quality, especially like Metallica stuff because they ripped it off the Rock Band games and whatever. But in this case, there isn't a backing track for the Dragon theme, so I wanted to make one. So that's why I pretty much went ahead and made this cover, but it's about 8 minutes long. But I'm going to show you a little bit of the transposition process, which is kind of a bit annoying, but it's also a bit easier as well, because nowadays we have AI, and with AI we can do whatever we want, really. So let's go ahead and let's begin. Here is like my third, or actually this is the first iteration of the Dragon theme from 2019 from the Music of Z album, which is like the worst album I've ever made. And the idea of the cover, my new cover, was to pretty much remake this into what I wanted originally. And at the time, it was pretty bad. Let's play it. It probably won't work. Oh, here we go. So it sounds nothing like Space Support or anything like that. I don't even know what I use here. A Scarlemare. So yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, finding the chords here, or chorus. I mean, it was very early on in the game, and I didn't know what chorus to use, and I don't think anyone knew, because it's a very special chorus and it was very difficult to find and also to translate into a digitized format. So yeah, here we got the guitars, which we all know and love. Way too much reverb on there, but this is like the original project. Very terrible. So the other idea for the cover was to add a bass guitar, and I originally toyed with this idea, and you can hear it here. It's very terrible. Yeah, oh, very muddy. I don't even know what I recorded this on, but it was quite a while ago. Yeah, so that's why this song, or this cover in particular, the new cover, it's more of a 90-10 ratio, I guess you would say, of faulconer sounds or DBZ, cake mix, whatever sounds, compared to my other covers, which is more like 50% new sounds and 50% faulconer or whatever. So that's why it's a bit more traditional sounding, I would say. And here is how I usually transpose things. So I transpose things in a separate project from the final recording project. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. If I have like a MIDI, I always try to create or credit the creator of that MIDI file. Half of the times there isn't a MIDI file, so I have to listen to the song and try to break down each parts and transpose them on a keyboard or a guitar or whatever. And that's what I had to do here. So that's why this is on This is number 3. There's like 2 other renditions, but they don't have any sounds loaded, and it didn't work for me. But that is how I started. So I'll show you how I actually transpose things. The first thing I always do is get the key of the song. And for me, getting the key makes transposition easier because, oh, this is a key of G. So all the notes in G are, it's going to work for the solo or whatever, or the rhythm. But in this case, I did not have anything. So, and most of the time I can't even figure out how to get a key. It's usually just playing around, jamming with the guitar. Oh, it sounds good with an E chord or G chord or whatever. It didn't work on this case because it's not really like super guitar driven. So what I did was find a website called TuneBat. And with TuneBat, I'm able to just drag and drop the file and get the key, the BPM, and some other thing. I don't know what it is, but it's very, very useful. All right, so I selected the file and it's opening up right now. It's gonna detect the key, the BPM, and the alt key, which is what I was talking about earlier. I'm not sure what that is actually. I never used that before. I do know the Camelot wheel, which might be related to that, but yeah, here's our BPM, 134, and the key of G minor. So I, just go to Google or whatever and then type in key of G minor, and then you can see all the notes that relate to G minor, and the song is easy to transpose from there because it's, especially this song, because the Dragon theme is pretty much a loop. Here we have a whole bunch of stuff going on. This isn't even like the final recording. I mean that not in a Dragon Ball Z sense, but you know what I mean. This isn't the final one, but here is the synth choir, and here is the sound that took forever to get. The spacey Vox voice. I use these settings. Again, I don't really use this a lot. I always use the hardware, so I always route everything through the Roland S760, which gets me a more refined sound. And I guess you could use this if you didn't have a Roland S760. You could always, use a filter. I do need to make an IR. With the IR, you might be able to get a more, or impulse response, you might be able to get a more refined sound or a sound closer to the Roland S760. But these are the settings I used here, and I thought they sounded pretty good. And then there's Ocean Mood. I don't know if that's used in the recording. Again, when it comes to transposing songs, especially the faulconer stuff, it's more like a guess of what they used. Sometimes it is very easy to figure out, like, hey, they used the U20 guitar. It's obvious. It's right there. You hear it. Or they used this drum. It's very easy, but sometimes with the pads, it's very hard to decipher. Pad New World, that's like a generic sound I use as a placeholder. So here's what it sounded like. So that's the intro part. And this is a bit of an odd key, but and then the drums enter right here. And if I turn on the key snap to G minor, you can see like all the notes pretty much align to the key of G. And that's not always the case, there might be like a few notes that are not really on the key. I mean, it's music, you can do whatever you want really. But it did make the transposition process easier. So another thing I did to get the sound of the isolated sounds of the Dragon theme was to use a program called Splitter. That's what I used to use. Now I use something called Demux, but there is another program online called Lala.ai. One of the first AIs I ever used in like 2019. And it was it did a decent job, I'd say. It wasn't like the best or the worst. You can split the tracks into like a synthesizer or an acoustic guitar. But that was the problem. Like it could only do like one track at a time. And it wasn't always super accurate. I'm pretty sure it's now a bit better than compared to like 2019 or 2020 when I first used it. But it helps a lot with breaking down the individual tracks. So I'm going to show you what I had with Demux, which is a program I use on Windows. You can use it on Linux probably, like anything, but it's easier on Windows for me. So that's the original, right? It's very easy to decipher like the chords and sounds and all that. But it's not perfect, which is why I made this cover, because it's quite warbly, I guess. It would be like quite distracting. Like you can like hear some audio glitches. Even if I turn on the drums, it's a little bit better, but it doesn't remove the bass completely. You can still kind of hear it. And of course, there's the bass of the original. That sounds nothing like any of the Alesis patches I've ever heard. Like I said, it's very warbly, very muddy. So yeah, AI is not perfect at all. It's close, but you know, it's more fun to like break down the whole track. And that's what I did with the drums. You know, I just moved the drums up here. And when I mapped the drums, I just followed what the actual track was doing, and then I timed it with it. Since the song was extended a little bit in the intro, it's a little bit off. Here's my drums and the original. And that's the transposition process. Again, I didn't really like sweat over this too much. It was pretty easy. It's a simple loop, and it keeps looping and looping again. And I did change it in the final recording, so I'll show you that next. But I also want to show you the leads. That is the easiest, or I want to say the easiest. It was the easiest because there's a YouTube video by Gov's Legacy or something like that, where he has like a piano and he's piano roll, like a vertical one, and it shows all the notes for the solo, and it made it easier for me to transpose. But it's also a bit different here because I also had to use a mod wheel to try to like emulate what Scott Morgan was doing for the solo. And I toyed around over here. It wasn't super difficult, as it's still like a repeating pattern. And it follows the key of G, I think. Sometimes it's a little bit inaccurate. Let me see. Yeah, so it's all in the key of G, it seems. I do have this tool in Reaper, like if you select a few notes, it tells you like what chord. It's not always accurate. Like it tells you what chord it is. Like right here it says C11 omit 9. That's like a crazy chord. But it's very helpful with transposition. And again, like always, I always play stuff very slow. In Reaper, I turn it to like 50, and then I right click that button here, preserve pitch. That way it sounds normal, kinda, but not. If I were to uncheck the preserve pitch setting, it sounds like a ambient thing. I don't know. It sounds pretty cool, I'd say, but it's very hard to transpose if you use that setting. It's like if you put it in pulse stretch or something. So yeah, it's a little annoying doing it this way, but that's how most people learn songs. They play it very slow and then they raise up the speed. So here's what it sounded like when I finally finished transposing. So we got the intro. It wasn't fleshed out here, it was fleshed out in the later stage, but it gives you an idea. So there you go. Here's the intro, the liquid stack right there. I used the Soundfont and some compression. It's very thin because of the bass, but that's the only bass I used here. Yeah, I used past peak. I'm not sure what that is, but it sounded pretty decent. So, we got the intro, and then the guitar part. Yeah, the guitar part sounds so much better than the other one. And what I did here was create chords. Because if you play the notes on top or on the bottom by themselves, it's very thin sounding. And then there's the piano. And then we do the Legacy of Goku style solo. And then I changed the bass actually. So it does a different pattern. It's more similar to the game here. And then it repeats again. I'll show you the rest in the actual final recording project, because I do a lot more over here, like change the drums and stuff. So let me show you that. So here is the final recording. I do my projects in 3 stages. So the first stage is what we just were playing, which is the transposition or transposing phase or project. I lay down the tracks, I lay down all the ideas, and then I flesh them out in this stage, which is the recording and editing stage. This is where the final recording is done, all the mixing is done, all that stuff. And then the final one is the mastering stage, which I'll show you later. But here, I always do a reverb bus. The delay bus is only for the leads. So I route all the leads to this here. I also routed the bass and hi-hat for some reason. I guess I was experimenting there. And for reverb, I route all the buses here. For the buses, I have choir, drums, guitar, clean guitar, rhythm guitar, a real rhythm guitar, bass guitar, synth bass, synth strings, synth lead, synth bus, synth pad. There is so much going on here, but it all comes together. And I'm not sure how I work with this many tracks. You know, when I first started, it was just, let's see, like 17 tracks. And now we're dealing with 80 tracks, which is quite a difference. And of course, these two don't really count, but still. You'll see here that the master parent folder send is unchecked. I always turned it off for whatever reason, because I felt like I had to do it. But apparently you don't, because I was creating extra work for myself, so you don't even have to do that anymore. For the MIDI stuff, I don't do it this way either. I would right click here and then MIDI output. Kind of like in my old video, the tutorial video, which you should watch. You would right click MIDI output, MIDI out, send all the MIDI to whatever hardware synth you're using. And then I would record it on this different track here. But I don't really do that anymore. Click FX, add FX chain, and then I do MIDI hardware. And I use something called RIA insert. I don't send anything audio-wise to my hardware, but I do send the MIDI. And then it comes back through the left and right channel. So that way I can keep everything in one track. And then I could copy and paste and then turn off this VST as needed, because you can only record one hardware patch on the Alesis and Roland and all that stuff. My philosophy here is to go top down always. So I start with master bus here and I add every single VST I want to refine the sound before I even do anything here on these other tracks. Like once I finish recording, once I finish editing, I add all these VSTs to refine the sound of what I have. And if it sounds better and it sounds closer to my reference track, which is up here, which is the original Dragon's theme, as well as Call Out the Dragon, which is like a intro, extended intro. If it sounds close to it, then I continue to work on these pads, or buses, I mean. Add saturation always. Do some EQ. And then I add a compressor, and then another EQ, and then imager. So the imager is to expand the stereo field of the sound I'm working with, or the music I'm working with. In this case, it looks like I turned down the stereo field on the bass. The reason for that is because I don't want the bass to be everywhere. This song is very bass heavy. It has a bass guitar, it has synth bass, it has different basses going on. So I had to turn down the width, so it's not all around. Same with the lower mid section. I wouldn't even call this the mid. It was like more lower, higher bass. And then the mids, I turned it up a little bit to spread it out. Same with the high frequencies. And then I always do a match EQ for certain tracks. Especially for this project, I wanted to like get close to the original. So I created a reference capture of the original track. And you just click capture, and then you apply it to your track, which should be the whole bus here. And that's always done after I do all my processing and stuff. So once all the processing is done for every single track, then I do that. And if you're doing it this way, you're always going to do refinements at the end anyway. So just to keep in mind. And then weird EQ. I don't even know what I was doing here, but we'll find out once I start playing this thing. So we have the master bus all set. Then I went to each individual bus. So now we can go to the choir busing. So let us start here. So I do some saturation again to make it sound a bit more fat, I guess. Some EQ. I cut the low frequencies again. There's a lot of bass going on, so I try to cut as much bass as I can on every single track. The bus stereo. This is set on the mic studio, and then I put some drive. Gives it a more of a different character, and I like adding it to all my tracks. And then of course, for the MIDI tracks, I don't really add anything. It makes no sense because in this case we have everything on the audio. And for audio, for ocean mood, we have an EQ, and that's it. So most of the time, for individual tracks, I don't really do a lot, because For the QS6 especially, there's lots of processing done by the synth already, and it already sounds good. So the only thing I do is do some EQ, and that's it. Your biggest change, or the biggest change you can do with mixing is volume. Here I change the volume a lot, and you'll see a lot of automation clips like that around here. I don't even know if they're called automation clips. So you would click here, trim, and then you select whichever parameter you want to change. So volume, pan, width, volume, pan, pre-effects, you know, all that stuff. All that good stuff. And then we got the synth box or space box, whatever. Stereo enhancer, I just wanted to make it sound wider. And I did play a lot with the volume. I mean, it was crazy. So let's see what it sounds like. So as you can tell, like there's a little bit of a glitch here. It's because of this. Whoops. It's because of this here. It starts from like nothing and then it immediately jumps up to like negative 1.4 dB. So it does have like a little bit of a glitch. But because I have so much more going on in the track, it's barely audible. But you know, it's some of those mistakes, you know, that kind of gives the track some liveliness, I guess. So let's listen to it again. Like, it's barely noticeable. So that's the choir by itself. And it repeats again and again. I don't think I changed it ever. So yeah, I recorded that whole thing in one go, and that was like about 8 minutes. Yeah, so an 8-minute track. The other thing I do actually before sending the MIDI out to the hardware is I do something called humanization, or getting stuff off the grid. Because if you leave stuff on the grid, it sounds way too robotic, I feel. So what I do in Reaper is right click and drag, and then I select my notes. But in this case, I did everything, so I did Control A, selected everything. And then here I have this little thing, this little dude here, humanize notes. And I select the timing. So if I want like a crazy timing, like 100%, it will change everything. You can see the notes kind of move a little bit. I usually keep it around like 1 or 2%. That way it's not exactly on the grid and it sounds a bit more natural. Same with velocity. You don't want everything at 100%. I keep it around 20 or some. That is something I probably went over in the previous tutorial, but you know, I like reiterating that because that's a very important thing that I do. And then ocean mood, it didn't really change at all. I think it's like the same chords. Yeah, it's very similar to the the Spacey Vox chords. It just has like an extra layer. So very simple chords. It starts with a G minor, and then it goes to it adds like a separate note. It goes like up a step or something like that. But again, key of G, then it goes to E flat major, and then E diminished, and then it ends on G minor again, and then it repeats. So that's very simple chord progression. And I think it's the same with like the choir here. It's like there's a B flat octave, D, so B flat, D, E flat, E, and it repeats. And then there's some changes here, but it's nothing crazy. So that is the choir. So all together, it creates this awesome soundscape, especially when the song starts going. So I'll play a couple seconds of that. So that's it, and it repeats over and over. It's one of those loops that's like so good. It's repetitive, but it's so good, you know. And we have the reverb, of course, and that's what it sounds like. It has pretty much everything routed to it. Same with delay. And I think I know why I sent the hi-hat there, because I know the hi-hats are a little bit all over the place in that original song, so I added it to the delay bus. So let's do the drums. That was the most simple part, I would say, of the track. Again, it's a simple loop. I start with a snare reverse and a snare verb, and that's for the intro part. Try to make it as big as possible. And of course, you know, I'm sure the original sounds a lot bigger because they probably use a different processor. But here's the processing I did. I just used HComp, NLS again, and that's about it. For the bus, there wasn't much else going on. And drums, the drums MIDI again. The drums in this is actually a little bit different, especially when it gets to the log section or Legacy of Goku section. The kick pattern changes. There's a bit more hits, and I do try to change it throughout the song slightly, but it's still like the same beat, I would say. And at the end, you know, I added like a double pedal section here to end it. And then the outro, which is the toms, which I'll show you, which is the alternate version, I think, of the Dragon theme. I never heard it in the show, but apparently there's an alternate version, and I wanted to add it. Kick. The processing I use is a compressor and another compressor. Again, I would probably do it a little bit different. After all, this kick doesn't sound anything like the original. It's a little bit different. There's more reverb, there's more processing. I think Mike Smith, who composed this track, just used the simple Roland S760. But I wanted to make everything sound even bigger, if that made sense. There's 3 snares. The first snare, I mean, they're all the same. They're just different processing. It's the snare from the same kit, which is the R&R drum kit number 1. And I use just a regular compressor here. So you should know that snare. Second snare, I use reverb and compression. That's it. I guess I wanted to add like a little bit of a tail to the original snare. And both of these together. And I turned that all the way down. Yeah, so that's like a longer reverb. So all together. Yeah, so it's a very interesting sound. Hi-hats. I originally thought this thing was using a crash in the original track, but it's apparently a hi-hat. I think there's a setting in the Roland S760 to make it ping pong like naturally, but in this case I couldn't figure it out, and it's also a pain to work on that little screen of the 760. So I just used the hi-hat or the JS script here called ping pong pan, which I turned at 0.4 frequency and the width at 65. And I did a lot of automation here to change it. So compression again and some EQ. And it's probably a little bit of compression, nothing crazy, but here's what it sounds like. Again, it's probably not super accurate to the original. I mean, I have probably a better drum set somewhere in my VST folder or library, so I wasn't too crazy about the drums in the song anyway, but it sounded close enough. But that's the idea of the ping pong pan. It goes from left to right, kind of like in the original. And then we got the crash. Very simple stuff. I just had like an NLS channel to give it some more body. And let's listen. And toms. Very simple stuff. I used the grinder toms again from the R&R kit. Vintage verb. And some compression and EQ. I should have turned down I should have cut out the low frequencies, but I guess I forgot on this one. Again, not a lot of processing overall for those drums. I didn't want to go too crazy. I could have made it even sound more close to the original, but you know, at that point, you know, I just wanted to get the track over with because there's a lot going on and we still got like a few more buses here. So let's play the drums. So yeah, it changes a little bit in the log section. And it pretty much repeats the whole way through. There's a few changes here and there that I did. Like adding another kick or adding a few more hi-hat hits, but nothing crazy. I still try to stick with the original in this case. And now we have the synth guitar. So the famous synth guitar, the U20 or U20 Power or whatever you want to call it. I added saturation to the bus, EQ, cut down the low frequencies, and then some compression there. Again, most of these were in mono. These are mono tracks most of the time, especially the kick. I think the snare stereo, snare stereo and the hi-hat. but everything else is in mono. Okay, so we have the synth guitar, the U20 guitar, whatever you want to call it, U20 power. Very simple track, or simple part. It's just four chords. We got D, then we got some other B flat. It changes slightly. I mean, it's not nothing crazy. Yeah, it's like it's literally repeating itself. So I didn't really change anything here. I did add a delay here. So here's the delay. That is to simulate like the actual original track where the guitar fades out, but it has like some sort of delay or reverb on it. So I added this reverb here, and it seemed to sound pretty close to the original at least. And then I have the automation for the whole bus, which is to turn down the volume as soon as the track closes out. Very simple. Didn't do much with this. Clean guitars. So this is something that is one of the original things I did, I guess. Like I said, it's like a 90-10 ratio. This is the 10%. And it is a guitar, normal guitar, and I just played some chords. And the chords I followed were for, I was following the Space Fox Choir, whatever chords here. So here's what it sounds like. So I used a XFX2 for this, and the patch I use is called Black Hole, and it is very reverby, very distant sounded, and I really like that. And I felt it would work perfectly with this song because I always wanted it to be a bit more ambient, and since I'm taking the track and making it sound bigger and wider, grandiose, I wanted to add this, and it worked perfectly, I think. The tab is in the description of that video, of the cover I did. And it is pretty simple. There is nothing complicated here at all. It's just a simple chord progression that I followed. So we will skip to the rhythm guitars, which is another track that I really didn't use any processing at all, except for the bus. So for the bus, I used the Neutron Pro to give it a more distorted electric guitar sound at 70%. Cut out the low ends again and added some compression. So here's what it sounds like. Following the same pattern as the synth guitar. So I do change it up here, and I do follow the bass guitar, or the bass of the song. So here's what it sounds like. It's not 100% accurate to the bass of the original song, of the faulconer version, or Mike Smith version, because it follows the bass pattern of the Legacy of Goku 2 version, which has that little higher note in the middle, which is why it sounds a little different. But I thought it worked perfectly here. And if I turn off the processing, you'll hear the difference here. It not only makes it louder, but it adds like a little bit more fizz and fuzz and distortion. Makes it sound a bit more lively. So that's it for rhythm guitar. So bass guitar, it's one of those things again, you know, it's just one track. If you haven't noticed, there's these DI tracks. That is just the clean sound of the recording. So there is no processing at all. So it sounds like a wet noodle, I would say. Yeah, it has no processing at all. And the DI for the bass is the same. And this bass playing is much better than the original of the 2019 version, I mean. So here's the 2019 version. Yeah, no wonder I cut that out. But this is much more in line, and what I really wanted to do originally was to have a bass guitar or backtracking for the Dragon theme. So I decided to play the bass guitar. So it's very straightforward. Again, it's just a repeat of the regular synth bass, which is up here, which we'll go over next. But before we move on, here's the processing for the bass. Again, compression, and then EQ. I always EQ after compression because sometimes the sound changes when you do compression. And if you do EQ before, it messes things up. But you can always experiment. Bass bus, which is the actual synth. So for the synths, I used polysynth on the QS6. I used quadratics and volume knob, which is they all play a certain role. I wasn't really sure. Like again, even with using splitter, demux, or any kind of stem extractor, I still can't tell which exact bass they used, because I wasn't sure if it was polysynth or quadratics or any of these. It's obviously not volume knob, but I added volume knob as an extra layer. So here's the volume knob. Adds like an extra layer on the bottom, and that's why it's very low. It's like -10. Polysynth, this is recorded in mono, or I changed it to mono, so that way not everything is stereo and it clears up the stereo field a bit. But here's polysynth. This is what I originally thought was the bass in the original Dragon theme from Mike Smith. Again, very straightforward. It's the same pattern over and over. It does change again in the Legacy of Goku section, but nothing crazy. Quadratics sounds a bit more closer to the original track bass, so let's take a listen. So again, I'm not really sure which one to use. It was a decision I had to make. So I said, in my gut feeling, I felt like quadratics sounds closer to the original. So I made polysynth a mono track and lowered the volume a bit, and went with quadratics as the main bass. Again, it doesn't really change until we get to the Legacy of Goku section. It follows the same pattern here. When it gets to the Legacy of Goku version, we have that high note I was talking about. And then it changes at the end, right here. And the bass guitar follows or does something quite similar to this at the end. And then it repeats again, and then we add that high note again somewhere in the somewhat close to the end here. And then the final part, which is the outro, it uses a different bass altogether. It's called Celli or Celli. That's for that outro part. Again, nothing crazy here. I did not do any processing on these tracks at all. I felt it sounded perfect. But I did do some processing on the bus, which is saturation, some compression again, and Ria EQ, which is the EQ for Reaper. Again, I do compression and then I just play around with it, try to see what sounds best. There isn't really a set standard. I do know it says bass here as the preset, but I usually switch to the preset and then change things and try to find what sounds best. Alright, so next thing we have is synth strings. And that sounds probably a bit familiar. The hyper strings I used here, it has a similar chord progression of Ocean Mood, which is also from the QS. Again, these are all QS sounds. So here is Ocean Mood and synth strings, or hyper strings. So the Dragon theme is very reliant on these big, grandiose pads and synths. And I felt like adding Ocean Mood. I wasn't sure if it was Ocean Mood or Hyperstrings, but I felt adding or leaving Ocean Mood in gave it a certain different quality. And it also has that little ocean sound. You can kind of hear it in there. It sounds like the ocean a little bit. And I really like that. So I'm not sure if they use both or they use one or the other. Again, it's one of those things where you don't really know. But I did use hyperstrings for this track. Again, nothing special. It just followed the same chord progression. I did not use anything on the mod wheel, like modulation wheel. I didn't do anything crazy like that. But I did add some stereo enhancement again, just like on Ocean Mood and, well, I'm not sure. I don't think I use it on Ocean Mood. I just use it on the choir. But I did put it on here as well. Then we have Dream Strings, which is like a sad, the sad strings that it's used a lot in Vegeta's themes, but it's also used in the intro here. That. and it's used in the end here. Yeah, very simple tracks. Again, I just take the isolated tracks. In this case, I use like a fan rip of the Call Out the Dragon extended version, and it has like this part. And then I slowed it down and wrote down the MIDI and then tried to match it as close as possible. In this case, it seems to be following the key of G again, so that's why you gotta know your key. Makes it a lot easier. And then we have, whoops, let me zoom back in. We have the Piz violin, or Pizzicato violin. And this is in the intro. Again, another QS sound. It's used in the intro of Call Out the Dragon. And again, I took the track, split it down, and then tried to match the notes as much as possible. It's a little bit out of time because the track is over here, you know, uses a different time signature. I did switch it to 135 BPM, by the way. It seemed to be more suited to that BPM. So the leads, again, I use like fan videos. I use Splitter to try to transpose these little parts here. Lots of mod wheel. This is like when the mod wheel gets used a lot, especially. It was very crazy. So let's start with Fuzzbox, which is the most recognizable. It's probably not super accurate to Scott Morgan's playing, but I'd say it was close enough. And in the video, I know I show me playing it, but I can play a little bit of it, but I'm not quite as precise to play the whole thing. But the only processing I did here was cut down the high end a bit. That's it. Nothing crazy. So the log solo is a bit different. So this follows the solo version of the Legacy of Goku 2 track, Eternal Dragon or something like that. It is quite similar. I used the summon MIDI from KDS, like I did all those years ago. It follows the same pattern, but I did change a few things here and there. Originally, in the 2019 track, I just used the filter wow. Because I wasn't sure about Fuzzbox. I wasn't sure how to get that sound or if it was even used in the track. So, you know, over the years, I finally learned what tracks use what and what sounds are what. So I found the Fuzzbox lead. And I added that. And I didn't change the volume a little bit. I did change the volume a little bit here. I did start it very low and then raise it up a bit. And for overall volume, I did, when it gets to those quiet parts, I did lower the volume overall. And of course, I added some 303 SAW MW again, this is something you have to use the mod wheel for to get that sound. And I added some EQ, nothing crazy. And I think that's the only time I used that particular patch in this whole track. And then we have something special here. We got a Rage Masenko solo. This is like the track that's used. This track was apparently used in the Namek saga. And here's what it sounds like. Again, another Elisa sound called Coffin Bass. Didn't use a lot of processing, just compression and EQ. And then I had the Marcato strings to come in and support the bass. Again, just some compression. And then here we go. So this track here is very straightforward. I mean, it's just going up and down, up and down. And I'm not even sure if it's in the key of G. Let's see. Yeah, it is. Again, I'm not like a theory guru, but that's pretty much it. And I did have We Were Angels reference. It's like a little motif. I did change the key to match the key of G. So that's why it sounds a little bit different. It's a little bit off key, I would say, but you know, this was a little reference to the Japanese track, and I felt it worked perfectly here. There's a lot going on here. So we have the 74 square MIDI. We got this thing going on here. And then we have the solo that plays when Tien is fighting Imperfect Cell or Cell second form, whatever it is. This is a little bit of an odd piece, but I did manage to figure it out on piano. It was quite annoying. It's probably not perfect because I'm not sure what sounds they used. So I guessed, and I used Fuzzbox with the Zoom 9050, which is the preset crank and stack. So yeah, I could probably play like a couple bars there, but after that it goes a little crazy. I wasn't really sure how to play it. So I just went to the MIDI piano roll and then just mapped everything out. And I did add buzz clip, which is quite a strange sound, but I used that to reinforce the fuzzbox lead because I wasn't really sure what they used originally, so I added that too. So all together. Very cool. The next thing I did was return back to the original lead. And I did have the fuzzbox lead with the 9050 lead into the original fuzzbox. So I did add a automation here to start low and then go high, and then this track would fade away. I kind of wish I made this longer, but you know how it is. You can't go back in time. Again, we go back to the original keyboard solo, which is what we first heard in the very first part of the track. So it repeats again. I did change it by adding a little longer note at the end. And then we get back on track with the rest of the solos that Scott did. This is my favorite part. I like the 74 square lead when it kind of pairs with the fuzzbox lead. In the original, you can kind of hear the fuzzbox lead, and I wasn't really sure what they did, so I still played whatever I mapped before or transposed before, and I just lowered the volume a bit. But the 74 square, it's, again, I'm not going to go too much into the details of the leads. I mean, it just follows crazy patterns, and there's no way for me to like really explain it well. But I do use the mod wheel a bit. Again, there's no 74 square lead at all, except at the end here. So they kind of play at the same time, and then they both fade out. That's my favorite part as well, because it's easy to play. It's just two notes going back and forth. Because the 74 square has like a certain characteristic, you can't really recreate it on a Soundfont or sample. On the actual hardware, it creates like a siren effect, and it's very cool, and I really like it. And it happens when you play one octave lower and one octave higher, and you play them both, and it creates this cool sound. So that is 74 square, and then it fades out, and then I bring back the fuzzbox. And that's it. That's the whole lead. It does fade out again. Nothing crazy. The only thing I did was lots of automation just to match the original. Like, there's not a lot of processing going on here at all. Just lots of reverb and stuff. So we will move on. The second to last bus, which is the synth bus. There's not a lot going on here as well, but I did have the liquid stack, which I used for Zando Soundfont, and then I converted it to Wave because I thought I was going to do something more here, but I never did. Again, it's a very simple synth stack chord, G, and there's G chords again at the end. Very simple. And then at the end, and at the outro, there's something called Genesis Wave, which is another Alesis QS6 sound. And then liquid stack. An original solo sound. So I've used this to create a original sound here. Let's see. I forget what I was trying to go here. I was trying to like create like a Gohan Angers type of thing. But for some reason I used tubular bells because it sounded pretty good. So here's what I have. It's not really based on anything, except like the intro kind of sounds like Gohan Angers, but I never really like fleshed out the idea. And it was also like kind of like a nod to Vegeta, because you know he used it during the Final Flash. So it's like a mix of both. And it's something. It's probably like the only original part that I really added to the song. And last but not least, we got the synth pads, which they're mainly used in the intro. So, in the intro, we got spaceport. We all know this sound. Originally, I thought this was used as the choir or the high parts throughout the whole song, but it's not. It's synth or space fox or space voice. But say spaceport is used in the intro. So let's listen. Very nice sound. Again, nothing crazy. Just lots of G's and going up to B flat. Over and over again. Same with the end. The reason I do the lower G is because it creates like this little effect on the keyboard. It has like a startup kind of sound to it. That's why it sounded like that. So that's why I add the lower G's on there. And same with the end. Did add some compression, but nothing crazy. Lots of automation, of course, to fade out the tracks as we enter to the original or the main verse, which I have here as a region called verse 1. I should have had this all the way down so it fades out immediately, but I had it fade out longer, so you kind of hear spaceport in the intro verse a bit. And one thing I forgot to mention here was all the regions. You see all the regions. That's what I use a lot in my tracks. Markers, not so much anymore, but the markers here did help with transposing and editing and all the references I wanted to add. Like, oh, here I want to add TN solo or keyboard solo, etc. The next patch is Red Aura, or Red Aurora, which is the quite it sounds like it's not really used a lot, I would say, but it is quite recognizable. So let me play it. It sounds quite similar to Golden Fleece, so I added that as well here. Very quiet, and it's very quiet. And I did add another Golden Fleece in B. This one's even lower in volume. So altogether, we have this. And that has like a little sparkly effect. And then at the end, it's a bit more interesting because we just have the Golden Fleece at the end. This is Golden Fleece with Dreamscape, sorry. So Dreamscape is another pad / sound that I barely used in this track, but it is used in the end, so here we go. It has like that watery sound, and then we have the sparkly effect with Golden Fleece. So that is the whole track. So I will mute some parts, and then I'll start with drums. Or I'll start with the synth, actually, the synth pads. And then slowly introduce everything. So that's like the first part of the Dragon's theme. As you can see, muting the bass, or as you can listen out, muting the bass, it's very clean. There's no warbly effects like you would see using the AI splitter or Lala AI or something like that. It's very, very awesome that I was able to like recreate all this. But I did turn off the master effects to see what it would sound like, and it does enhance the sound a little bit. And that's the point of this master bus, is to enhance the sound. I don't want to create like something so different that it totally changes the sound that I already had. Okay, so we have the master bus here, or the master in project. This is the final step. I have imported my track into this, and I did change the rate or the tempo a little bit, because I did notice like, oh, maybe 134 does sound, or 134 BPM does sound better, so I did change that. But for mastering tracks, I always use Kramer tape stereo. Normally I put this on the master bus beforehand, but in this case I put it in the actual mastering project. I don't do it that way anymore. I just put it on the previous project. But I always use Ozone Pro, and I try to match the try to use the equalizer and all that stuff from the reference track. So I go to Master Assistant and then choose the Dragon theme or whichever track I'm going to use. And nowadays I do use a multi-band compressor like Pro MB, and then I add that here. And mastering is essentially just making things a little bit louder and refining the sound a bit. So normally I also go to the volume and fix things a little bit, but in this case I really didn't have to do it. And in the mastering chain I have a frequency analyzer, which I use to look at the sound visually, make sure there's like no weird frequencies popping out. And I use WLM stereo or WLM meter stereo to see what the long-term LUFs are. Normally it's around 14. So it could go as high as 8 as well, but I usually want to keep the true peak below 0. That's the main thing I'm looking for. And there's also Pro L, which I use, which I can use to set the output level. I use Different. Apparently that helps. I have not seen a difference, but I still turn it on anyway. Oversampling, I set it to 8 or 16. And I just added a little bit of gain, that's it. And oscilloscopes and dynamic range meters, I just use them as references. So let's go ahead and play this. As you can see, the frequency is pretty generic. It's not nothing crazy here. As long as, you know, it follows this certain pattern, I'm okay with it. The LUFs are around 14, which is what I want. Sometimes I can go higher. And if you're like mixing or mastering for a CD, it sometimes goes higher. And loudness range is 7, which is good. For certain genres and stuff, it can go as low as 2 or 3, but I like to keep everything dynamic. And once I'm done with these tracks, I always go to like render and save it to the same directory where all your files are at. I turn div master, I add some metadata, and I use the ID3 and, fill in all the information there. And I save it as a wave, and secondary as MP3 and 320 bits. And I always export at 24-bit for wave. And that's pretty much about it. There isn't much else to talk about, so hopefully 2026 is a better year than 2025, I hope, for everybody. And I can't wait to finish the Legacy of Goku tracks, because I know we have like 3 more that I have to do. And once that's done, I can work on Legacy of Goku 2, and probably do a few other games here and there, and hopefully remake the Music of Z album, because I'm tired of paying the licensing fees. It's kind of annoying. But that's all for now. So hope you guys have a happy new year, or a good day, or whatever. So until then.